Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the ISAS seminar, New Zealand and India towards deeper economic and strategic engagement in the Indo-Pacific. Maybe I should start with a disclaimer. I know almost nothing about New Zealand and India relationship, but having worked something on trade and economic issues, perhaps I can understand maybe to what our expert today will be presenting. Because I was to chair this session, I just had a quick look at the relationship, particularly on the trade front between New Zealand and India. It turns out that for both the countries, for New Zealand, India, as it exists, is not an extremely important trade partner, particularly from the kind of volume of trade that the two countries have. Same thing with New Zealand as India's trade partner, right? Because if you look at where these countries stand in terms of the bilateral trade volume, it's extremely modest. I think it's about little more than $1 billion in merchandise trade between the two countries. Similar in terms of services trade, and India having some kind of a surplus around, particularly merchandise, around $200 million of surplus trade with New Zealand. So the two countries have recently, just like in end of April, 27th of April of this year, they signed a bilateral free trade agreement. This agreement, the free trade agreement, had been initiated actually in 2010. The two countries had started negotiations, and there were 10 rounds of negotiations to sign a free trade agreement. But then 2015, they stopped because India was also part of the RCEP negotiations at that time. So I think the two countries thought that once both would be in RCEP, maybe there was no need of a bilateral trade agreement as such between two countries. But then India later on withdrew from RCEP. So now New Zealand is still in RCEP, India is not. Then I think that might be the reason why, again, these countries went forward with negotiating the bilateral free trade agreement, and they have won this year. So in the context that the two countries don't have so much, means perhaps there is a huge opportunity for both by entering into a free trade agreement to elevate the level of trade that the two countries have. And this, always called a free trade agreement, I think investment is also a part of it.
Yes.
So that brings in another important aspect of this bilateral free trade agreement. So to discuss the India-New Zealand bilateral economic partnership, we have Dr. Rahul Sen. Dr. Rahul Sen is assistant professor, senior lecturer at the Department of Economics and Finance at the AUT Business School in Auckland. He's also the fellow at the New Zealand India Research Institute in Wellington, an adjunct fellow at RIS in New Delhi. And earlier, he was a research fellow at our neighboring research institute here, ICIS, Yusuf Ishaq Institute, the ICIS. And the rest, I think, on his bio, I will go into all the details. You have it with you all in the promotional materials that had been shared earlier. So without much further ado, perhaps now I'll get over to you, Dr. Sen. Maybe you can have around 30-35 minutes of presentation, and then we can go into Q&A after.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Pushpa, for that wonderful introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. It's lovely to be, back here at NUS as an alumni. It's really good to come back here and present about particularly a topic on, as Dr. Pushpa said, few people know about, which is, what is happening really between New Zealand and India. And in the sense, the relationship has very, very recently gone towards more of a strategic engagement beyond an economic one. And what I will do, therefore, in my talk is kind of take you through a little bit around the background as to why this is happening now. And of course, what has been agreed through in the free trade agreement, and what could be some of the potential challenges in taking this relationship to what it is sort of envisioned to be. So let me essentially start with the timelines. So as it was mentioned, the two countries have been trying to sort of have a formal trade agreement since 2010. And almost 5 years, there were some talks around having a comprehensive economic cooperation agreement kind of thing. But the key issue at that time, which also kind of persisted this time as well, but somehow, there was something else which got over it. So at that time, the issue was really over dairy market access. And I think New Zealand was very firm at that point of time that if they are not going to get market access for dairy, then they do not want to get into a free trade agreement, because dairy, of course, is one of the largest exporting items for New Zealand, one of the largest sectors. So, and contributes to about 30% of New Zealand exports. So at that point of time, the negotiations sort of lapsed, and then nothing really moved forward till almost a decade, actually, if you think about it. And I'll show you the data in a couple of minutes and the trend that has followed since 2015. And you will see that actually, at least in the run up till COVID, in some ways, the trade were actually declining. And then after post COVID, it sort of, had a reset. And the reset was largely when the new government took over in 2023 by Prime Minister Christopher Luxon in New Zealand. And the first thing he announced was that the free trade agreement with India is our strategic priority. And I want to get this done within the first term itself, which was a 3-year term. In New Zealand, you have a 3-year term. So at that point of time, given the history, a lot of people were skeptical. They were thinking, oh, this doesn't look like it can happen, in the space of 3 years. But then New Zealand's current trade minister, Todd McLeay, really took it upon himself to make sure that, this agreement is reached. He probably traveled 7 or 8 times in a year to India, which is unprecedented we heard of for a New Zealand trade minister to India. And in fact, on one occasion, he flew to India in the morning and flew back the same night, which actually is something, again, a New Zealand trade minister has never done. And it is this proactive approach that he took towards, showing that intent to have that trade agreement. Things kind of clicked. Of course, we know that in 2025, there was changing geopolitical environment. We had, tariffs being announced through the US. New Zealand itself initially was kind of, I think they were charged a 10% tariff, then that went up to 15%. I think it's now back to 12.5% or something. So obviously, given that, and also the fact that during COVID, it was very clear that New Zealand's sort of reliance on some specific trading partners needed some kind of a diversification. It's all that kind of led to this reset. And the reset really started with the invite to Prime Minister Christopher Luxon to be a keynote speaker at the Raisina Dialogue in March 2025. And that's when they decided to restart the negotiations. And this is a record for India and so for New Zealand as well, probably. This FTA was concluded in 9 months. And it was actually signed this year in April 2026. It's still currently undergoing debate in the New Zealand Parliament regarding ratification. But largely, we expect that it has broad-based support, so it will be ratified at some point of time soon. The upgrade, although, is something which was fairly unexpected, at least during the time of the reset. Of course, it was great news that India and New Zealand were restarting those negotiations. 9 months, that was as if, that surprise was not enough. Then came the upgrade with Prime Minister Modi's recent visit to New Zealand, which was actually the first by an Indian Prime Minister in 40 years. So it was a very, very significant event for New Zealand. And this particular visit is where India officially kind of announced that it is elevating the ties with New Zealand to a strategic partnership. So therefore, it is not going to be just only about deepening economic relations through the FTA, not just about trade, but it's also going to be about defense cooperation, about maritime cooperation, security, and people-to-people relationship. So therefore, if we ask ourselves this question, that this sudden momentum that we see, from the reset to the upgrade in terms of how the relationship has changed, it looks like it is kind of, driven by two factors. Definitely is driven by the fact that the two economies did notice their complementarity and the shared Indo-Pacific interests, particularly in the area of defense and maritime security. But to some extent, the fact that it was also that country, both India and New Zealand, were facing, tariff escalation from their major trading partners. So they also wanted to find out alternative areas for market access. So certainly the geopolitical moment sort of, I would say, gave up momentum to, this relationship. So in many ways, I've kind of therefore covered this, that if we think about why this relationship has taken such a momentum over the last couple of years, particularly in the context of the Indo-Pacific, certainly the first factor is from the New Zealand side, where post 2023, there has been some recalibrations around foreign policy with respect to having a broader diversification strategy. And Asia, of course, has been a big part of it. So ASEAN, as you know, has been one of New Zealand's largest trading partners. And of course, ASEAN and New Zealand have a trade agreement along with Australia way back from 2009, which was also upgraded. So clearly, from New Zealand's perspective, as Pushpa was also saying, earlier the idea was that, of course, since India was part of RCEP, if New Zealand could could get the RCEP agreement with India, then of course it didn't need that bilateral. But clearly, from India's perspective, India wanted to look at more bilateral agreements rather than being a part of the big regional agreement of RCEP, largely because of the fact that, from the Indian perspective, as we all know, they saw this as to be very much China driven, and therefore they wanted to have a bilateral focus in terms of pursuing these agreements. And therefore, in that context, that whole reset with India sort of was thought of. Also, more recently, with Prime Minister Modi's tour, incorporating Indonesia, Australia, and New Zealand, this was very much signaling the fact that India is looking at deepening its security and economic footprints both into the wider Indo-Pacific region, particularly South Pacific, and therefore Indonesia, Australia, and New Zealand were kind of all chosen at the same point of time for the tour. And a big part of this is also related with the shared maritime interests, particularly from India and New Zealand's perspective, because both are, middle powers, maritime powers, and both have a very strong stake in keeping, and the Indo-Pacific region stable in terms of fishing control, in terms of having the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea-based Order, in terms of maritime security. But let me go to the trade relationship, which is really where it kind of all took off. So if you look at the numbers right now, as Pushpa had also mentioned, two-way trade is only around 3.9 billion, close to $4 billion as of year ended March 2026. But the target is to double this, and this has been agreed as part of the joint declaration statement when Prime Minister Modi visited New Zealand. So right now, India's rank among New Zealand export market is the 11th largest, which clearly shows that there's a lot of potential here for expansion of the trade relationship, and even just 1.8% of New Zealand's total goods and services. So one thing is very clear, that from this reset that has happened and the momentum that it has picked up since Prime Minister Modi's visit, with all these targets set, there has to be a focus here now on not just goods trade, but certainly on having the trade momentum go towards services and investment. And the reason for that, I will explain shortly when I go into the details of the FTA. So Where India sees this FTA is in terms of a long-term developmental partnership. So for India, one of the key gains that it sees in having this FTA with New Zealand is essentially to also improve on its agricultural productivity through these centers of excellence that it plans to build with New Zealand agricultural business partnerships. So from New Zealand perspective, of course, India is the fastest growing major economy. So very clearly, there is a clear rationale for New Zealand as a small open economy to pursue this trade agreement with India. But in terms of the complementarity, if we look at it from India's perspective, New Zealand is going to be some good source of high quality dairy inputs, wool, forestry, and horticulture technology. So it's not a very big, ambitious FTA in that sense, but in some selected areas, there are some interesting and quality gains that have to be made. So let's now look at the relationship over time. So as I was telling you, this increase from 2015, and this is the exports, actually saw a decline. And then post-COVID, the exports have actually increased even before the FTA, whereas the imports actually have been on an upward trend, even since 2015. But the big thing about the trade basket is this, that whether you look at exports or imports from New Zealand, it is travel services which has been dominating the trade basket. And I believe that with the FTA, we will see now more exports of all these products because tariffs, market access is going to be now easier for forestry, for wool, which will be actually zero on entry into force. For some fruits and nuts, that is also going to be tariff-free in a couple of years. India, although, is going to get 100% the market access, so it will be tariffs on all of this will be zero as the FTA kind of comes into force. So if we look at the overview of what has been achieved through this FTA, the bilateral FTA, look at India into New Zealand, 100% duty-free access, peak tariffs wherever they were, there weren't many, 10%, they have been eliminated. So some very specific products, such as ceramics, carpets, autos, and auto parts, they will basically go to zero. They used to be around 10%. Services access is actually a big one. If I correctly remember, there's going to be about 100 plus services sector, which will be now open for access. So IT, engineering, healthcare, education, construction, etc. And then there's a mobility category in terms of temporary mobility that has been agreed in this FTA. So that will include Ayush practitioners, yoga instructors, chefs, and music teachers getting a 3-year kind of visa, which will be non-renewable. And I'll talk about the immigration and mobility aspects in a little bit more detail shortly. And similarly, working holiday visas. So you can see that what India gets here is largely in terms of temporary mobility services and little bit market access, which is now, of course, going to zero. But from New Zealand into India, it's obviously largely more of a market access story. So India is going to cut tariffs on 70% of the tariff lines, which is basically covering 95% of bilateral trade value. And immediately, you're going to see a duty elimination on a wide variety of products, which are part of the trade basket, as I just showed you. But the most important part of this will be the tariff-rated quotas, which basically means that there are certain products for which there will be you will be allowed to actually import more quantity at a lower tariff. And this will be largely applicable to kiwi fruits, apple, manuka honey, and milk albumins. Of course, some minimum import prices denoted there. So dairy, which is, as I said, was a sticking point earlier, it still remains entirely excluded. So, but there are some aspects which I will be just discussing very shortly. And then a small part of it also includes duty-free industrial inputs like logs, coking coal, etc. Okay, so now let's come to the services, investment, and skill mobility, which is where really the safety is adding value. So what is happening is 100 plus services sectors are now allowed to operate in both countries on an MFN and national treatment basis. And therefore, it is going to be, open in terms of all the different modes of services that we can think of. So it's not going to be just mode one or mode two, it's going to be opened across all the modes. The unique part of New Zealand India FTA is actually this, and this is where a little bit of controversy is also being created. So, what this FTA is doing is there's a dedicated investment promotion facilitation chapter where there is kind of like New Zealand looks at it as a commitment that it has made. But from India's perspective, it is the idea that given that India is growing at such a rapid pace, New Zealand should aspire easily to invest about 20 billion US dollars in 15 years. So based on the long-term growth projections. And from New Zealand perspective, there's a big opportunity because most of the New Zealand businesses, given the economy is small, so they have to scale up their operations, innovate, and grow. And that is giving them an opportunity here to actually change the way they do business. And in terms of the more recent outreach events that have been happening on the FTA, and I've been part of a number of them in New Zealand, always that question has come from New Zealand businesses that why should we invest in India, and what are going to be the benefits? So one of the obvious benefits, of course, in terms of scaling up your operations is learning from the technology in India. Of course, as you grow there, you're able to repatriate your profits back home. Your economy can grow in return in terms of overseas investment. But the reason why I'm saying is this is a bit, controversial because historically, when you look at New Zealand's outward investments, it has been, first of all, not at a very large scale. And some very selected OECD countries like Australia, Japan, etc., have been those countries where New Zealand has invested. So I think this is going to be kind of a learning for New Zealand businesses in terms of actually going and investing in a country like India. And therefore, this particular aspect, I think, is going to be very, very closely watched as the FTA progresses, towards the next stage, because there is still, questions around, we are so small. Do you think we'll really be able to achieve a $20 billion US dollar investment in 15 years in India? Now, what India has done as part of other similar FTAs where it has had this kind of investment promotion in return for market access, a dedicated New Zealand FTA desk is supposed to be set up by Invest India. So Invest India, if you have seen its website more recently, has already added the EFTA desk, which is the European Free Trade Association one. And there, the commitment was, I think, around $100 billion or something. So for New Zealand, it's around 20 billion. And the idea is that this will therefore become kind of a one-stop shop from India's perspective to help New Zealand to invest in different areas, agribusiness being one of the big ones, because clearly India wants to partner with New Zealand agri-businesses. And as far as I remember, there has already been some MOUs signed by some agri-tech companies in New Zealand with some agri-tech companies in India. So the momentum is already picking up. Similarly, with finance and AI, I don't know whether some of you know, there is a New Zealand-based fintech company which has made great strides in India in actually, particularly in helping banks for valuation for residential property purposes, or digitizing the valuation. So there's already been these contributions that have been happening from New Zealand businesses into India, and if anything, I think this investment amount can actually probably be surpassed. So, but although at the moment, there is skepticism as to whether in 15 years this goal will be achieved. Not just agribusiness, finance, education, but even creative arts, traditional medicine, renewable energy. All these are areas where clearly there's a lot of opportunities for New Zealand to deepen that investment partnership. So, from India's perspective, therefore, as I see it, it's very clearly looking at New Zealand now as a long-term partner in its Vision 2047 development strategy. And of course, it is tied with the preferential access, because the FTA clearly mentions that after 15 years, if there isn't enough investment coming in from New Zealand, there will be a 3-year grace period. Of course, every 5 years, there will be consultative mechanisms to help New Zealand to facilitate their investments into India. But after 15 years, those 3 years grace period will be given. But following that also, if there isn't enough investment forthcoming, then India will reserve a right to revoke some of the preferential access that it has provided. And that is the part which actually is very controversial, because in New Zealand, some of the thinking is that, we could end up in a situation that we are not able to invest much, and then the preferential access that we have now is taken away. But again, that is something which is there written in the agreement, but very clearly it is not subject to any kind of dispute settlement, which basically means it's not legally binding. So the reading that I have made, and I'd written this there as an article as well, the idea here is that India will set up an investment facilitation mechanism to help New Zealand achieve these goals in return for the preferential access that it is providing. And we can see, as this example provided, that even before the formal ratification, and over the past couple of months only, this has happened, investment partnerships have already been announced, such as the Bioeconomy Science Institute, which is already in India's northeast states, helping it in its development of its kiwi fruit industry. So there are these small state-specific investments which are happening. So it's not that, the momentum is not there. The other one, which is also worth discussing a little bit more detail, is on that skilled labor mobility. And again, you might have heard in the media some very, colorful comments about, some kind of a tsunami of, migrants coming in from India through this FTA or whatever. So the interesting thing is, this skilled labor mobility provisions in this FTA is very clearly for temporary entry, and it's written in the document itself that it is that you have to show that you do not have any intent to establish permanent residence. So therefore, actually, from India's perspective, there is no intent or provided here for professionals to go there and immigrate into New Zealand. The idea is to utilize these labor mobility provisions to allow skilled professionals to provide their specific services for a 3 years time. So this is what is called the temporary employment visas, which is part of this FTA. It's a non-renewable visa for 3 years. And once that period is finished, you have to leave New Zealand. And to qualify for an extension, you have to be out of New Zealand for 3 years. So these provisions tell very clearly that actually there is no intent for this FTA to encourage immigration of Indians into New Zealand, although, you might have heard something else through the media. The other thing that is also important to note here is that these skilled labor mobility provisions are actually providing opportunities for postgraduate students also to get longer post-study visa work rights, which will be, I think, 4 years now compared to 3 years, and also for some very India-specific professionals to temporarily work. So what we can see that through this FTA and beyond, as I will discuss, I think what India is trying to do here is to, embed both the blue economy and the orange economy aspects through this FTA and through this relationship. The other thing to note here is that while this FTA is allowing these temporary employment visas for doctors, IT professionals, teachers, etc., to work in New Zealand for 3 years, but they still have to be suitably New Zealand qualified. So, which means that if you are into New Zealand to get a work visa, to work under this visa, temporary employment entry, you still have to, have certain qualifications which recognizes you as being equivalent to New Zealand qualified. So there is no mutual recognition of qualifications yet that has been, put in as part of this FTA. The last thing to note as part of the FTA discussion here is that the dairy exclusion is actually not total, because the quality ingredients from New Zealand, particularly milk albumins, and also another ingredient, dairy ingredient, will be integrated with India's value chains, because those selected ingredients are now actually allowed to be imported into India for re-export purposes. So therefore, it's kind of integrating some of those dairy ingredients into your value chains. So we all know that, from India's perspective, dairy has always remained and will remain the most sensitive sector so far as any FTA is concerned. And I think it has already been made very clear from the Indian side that whether it is EU or UK or New Zealand, doesn't matter, because our rural households depends on dairy livelihood. So therefore, we cannot open it up. For New Zealand, of course, again, this is one of the reasons why a big debate is going on as to, whether it is going to give meaningful gains, because as I said, dairy is like 30% of New Zealand's exports. So clearly that's a big part of products that is kind of left out here, we think about. But clearly the value chain links are going to grow. There's going to be growth in meat, wool, forestry, alcoholic beverages, wine, avocados, and all the other products. So it's not that there's not going to be, gains here. And very much this is part of the pattern when we look at India's recent FTAs. If you look at even the others that have been negotiated, there is always been ring-fenced, and therefore I think most FTA partners have now accepted this constraint and therefore being able to conclude those trade agreements. So when we look at the New Zealand perspective here and what trade negotiators have actually achieved, for one, they have opened the door in the sense of allowing quality New Zealand products, quality New Zealand dairy ingredients to be integrated with value chains, which definitely will make a difference to India's quality of dairy products that will be produced and probably exported from there. But the other thing that also is happening is New Zealand negotiators in the FTA have also very clearly put in a side letter saying that if ever in the near future, dairy is opened up for market access by India to any other trading partner, just a possibility, then New Zealand, as per MFN, will get that same access. So in many ways, they have already kind of futuristically thought that if in the near future, whenever it is, dairy is open, we will have the right to have that market access. And in return, of course, they have got the services and mobility gains, which, if you are looking at, in terms of quantitatively modeling and thinking about how much long term gain this is going to give to New Zealand, this is a bit of a hard question because unlike modeling methods where you can easily simulate tariff changes or non-tariff barrier changes for goods and therefore say yes, by 2030 or 2040 we expect this much percentage increase in GDP. This is really hard to model because, as I said, the investments are aspirational, so we do not know every year how much investments are actually going to be forthcoming. And also, the visas are there, but again, we do not know how many of them will actually be taken up from the Indian side. But clearly, those are the areas that develop that have that long-term potential here. And what can really fuel this forward is really the diaspora. So clearly, this is an area where I believe a lot more work will have to be done, particularly if the two countries have to really commit to that joint statement in terms of deeper economic and strategic partnership. Because we already have about 5.8% of the population of Indian ethnicity, which is around 292,000. It's the third largest ethnicity now in New Zealand. The growth has been phenomenal. And if you look at the GDP contribution, which was estimated by a very recent study, it's around $37 billion, which is by no means a small amount. And it is supporting 220,000 plus full-time equivalent jobs. So clearly, the Indian community in New Zealand actually is driving a lot of the economy and the economic growth. And that means that it is this diaspora, which really is a big asset, which should be tapped by New Zealand government here in terms of, um, driving this growth and relationship forward through this FTA, which hopefully, will be ratified. So a big part of this will undoubtedly still be international students because, as you saw in the graph, travel, particularly from the New Zealand export side, travel is actually largely education-based travel, which is due to international students. So clearly that, I think, the momentum around that will be picked up, particularly with the working holiday provisions and also the post-study visa work rights that are going to come into effect. But one of the interesting points that is coming out from the same report, which estimated this contribution of the Indian community to New Zealand, is that there is definitely an evidence of contribution, but without leadership. So therefore, clearly, there is a need here for more opportunities for people from the Indian community to get into more professional and civic roles into New Zealand and not just provide that economic input. So going forward, in terms of the strategic partnership, what has been agreed to 2030, I'll very briefly touch on that. And these are the 6 pillars. On defense and security, there is a memorandum of understanding which is now being implemented. So there will be, greater engagement between the defense ministries of both countries. There will be a joint working group on counterterrorism being set up, also around disaster resilience. Definitely, there'll be a lot more focus around people and education, which will now be sort of treated as a strategic infrastructure. But the big part is the maritime security. And I think that is where the elevation has happened post FTA in terms of taking this to the strategic partnership. So maritime cooperation agreement, hydrographic cooperation, mapping the oceans, mutual logistics support. So all that is going to be a big part of this relationship going forward. The aspirational goal is to double that two-way trade, as I said, to beyond at least around 7 billion, probably more than 7 billion. And at the same time, I believe by the end of 2030, if the FTA is ratified, by the end of this year because there's an election coming up in New Zealand, but hopefully it will still be ratified. So once it's ratified, after 5 years, there's supposed to be a review, particularly in terms of investment cooperation. So definitely there will be a review around whether that 20 billion over 15 years kind of aspiration is being achieved. And then we have the multilateral alignment, which of course has been agreed also that both countries will work mutually in terms of cooperating in ASEAN-led forums, Indo-Pacific Oceans Incentive, the UN Security Council reforms, and so on. So this is where, as I said, the relationship is really going fastest, which is maritime security. So trade took around 16 years, if we think about it, to ultimately conclude to the FTA. But defense and maritime arrangements have actually moved very rapidly if we look at the timeline here in the last almost 12 months, actually. So the maritime security is kind of therefore going to be a very priority pillar under the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative. And it kind of therefore also creates a natural sort of, convergence point with ASEAN in terms of maritime frameworks. So when we look at, what New Zealand has achieved in terms of the story that I told you and the FTA that has happened, it's also important to keep in mind here that New Zealand has definitely not got a first mover advantage here, at least in terms of the region. Australia has already got the first mover advantage because it already had this FTA since December 2022. And in many ways, actually, there was a very clear evidence of trade diversion, particularly in some products in favor of Australia and against New Zealand, which I think also force the momentum from the New Zealand trade minister's side to make sure that they do not keep losing that market access and therefore get that FTA done as soon as possible. So if you look at the numbers here in terms of the trade scale or the diaspora size, we can see that the story is very much the same. Of course, for Australia, the trade scale is much, much bigger, given the size of the diaspora, of course, which is also pretty bigger. But what can be seen is clearly from the New Zealand perspective, the relationship with India will evolve in a slightly different way because clearly it cannot compete with Australia on scale. That's not going to happen. So the value proposition will always be on niche sectors, and that's really where the outcomes are focusing on: agri-tech, education, dairy productivity, as I mentioned, agricultural productivity, and also that Pacific specific maritime cooperation, which we talked about. So it will be really interesting to see how this relationship particularly evolves in terms of both in economic and strategic ways, because some of the issues that because I have been also kind of looking at what Australia has been doing with India, and it appears that one of the key issues where we see the problem from the business side is that the business literacy around India is has been an issue in Australia, and that is why there has been focus on building up networks, bridging those networks between Australian and Indian businesses, educating them more about what's happening in India. And I think it's the same thing I believe needs to be done in New Zealand's case as well, because somehow that business literacy aspect is kind of lacking. So clearly, when we look at this bilateral relationship, this will, because of the reasons that I already discussed, and I'm not going to go through this again in detail, this is definitely going to therefore matter beyond just New Zealand and India. And I see this FTA as being a part of, therefore, India's broader strategy in terms of deepening its economic and strategic relationships in the wider Indo-Pacific region, and therefore that will also kind of interact with the Indo-Pacific maritime infrastructure, including that with ASEAN. And it will also therefore have an impact, I believe, on ASEAN India economic ties as well. And the reason I'm saying this is because some of you might be knowing that ASEAN and India are also reviewing the trade agreement that was signed. And because India's whole approach to FTA is now changing, focuses a lot more on investment and on mobility. I think the review on this ASEAN-India FTA will also be looking at this new aspect of India's FTA, which is basically focusing more on investment and labor mobility as well, which is something which was not there in the previous version of the agreement. So very quickly, what could be the challenges? The challenges really is in terms of being ratified, but not utilized very significantly. So select committee hearings are going on, and I expect that, because the bigger parties, which is the Labour and the National Party, have agreed to a broad-based support. We know that there is a divided coalition, which is kind of currently opposed under an agree to disagree, primarily because of dairy being excluded and also because of the investment clause, which it sees as being unachievable. But largely because there's a broad-based coalition, and I think the first hearing has already, they got a significant amount of votes to pass it through. So I do not believe there'll be an issue in ratifying this, but clearly there's a risk in low utilization. The risk is also there because the 2030 target has been set as aspirational. There is no modeling exercise that has been done. There is not any research that has really gone into what it will require to get to that 2030 target. Dairy politics, we do not know. That might come up, may not come up, but clearly the strategic partnership is going to be, again, very important here. And for that, it depends on continuity of government, and hopefully the new government that will come into New Zealand will be working, of course, on the similar lines. So from New Zealand perspective, just to end, I would like to say that to ensure that its value is fully utilized, there has to be more outreach of this FTA by relevant institutions. It has been happening in New Zealand. So if you have been following, you will notice that the momentum has certainly picked up in terms of having these outreach events by relevant institutions. There's also been focus on greater women participation because this FTA was largely a women-led FTA from India's perspective in terms of negotiations. But even from New Zealand's side, there's a lot of interest now to ensure that there's greater women's participation in this FTA in terms of having access to networks, finance, and knowledge sharing, and so on. Improving business literacy, as I said, is going to be really, really important. And last but not the least, I would like to end here kind of by saying that, because there's a lot more around India which needs to be, the awareness that needs to be there in New Zealand. I think there's ultimately, if this has to succeed, there should be some kind of a dedicated public policy think tank to brainstorm on New Zealand, India on the lines of, say, the Center for Australia-India Relations. So essentially, if one can have the ratification done by in 2026, have some sort of a concrete target in terms of what needs to be achieved to get to that 2030 doubling of trade, and of course, bring in more of the diaspora and anchor that maritime cooperation in the ASEAN compatible frameworks, I think we will see this relationship really move on to the next level. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sen. I think I learned a lot, of course, on India, New Zealand. I hope the same with the audience over here. We have 25 minutes for the Q&A, for the discussions. Let me open up the floor for the discussion. So if anyone has any question to start with.
Jordan has very strategically positioned the mic here.
He does it always.
Yeah, so one can understand the strategic capacities he has developed over the years. Rahul, thank you for that very exhaustive presentation. And I know that you have put your heart and soul into this framework. And I really appreciate that because it's an under-researched area, under-explored area. And I think the kind of work that you are doing in collaboration with some of your colleagues over there in New Zealand will really be of great benefit, because there are a number of not just analysis, but also facts, as Puspa mentioned, which you shared with us, which are quite striking. Having said that, I hope you won't mind if I come out with two thoughts, which to me are somewhat serious obstacles for the prospects of this FTA. One of them is that, like most of India's FTAs, with the exception of the FTA with UK and UAE, this is another FTA which doesn't have a chapter on digital trade. And I think that's something which really limits the scope of this FTA, and I'll explain why. It's also surprising that even the Australia FTA does not have a digital trade chapter, because Australia and New Zealand are actually digital economies very significantly. And as they go forward, a comprehensive part of their trade with the rest of the world will comprise of digital services, digitally delivered services. And I am assuming that there could be a situation in future when, even if New Zealand dairy giants like Fonterra might not get direct market access into India, they might still be in a position to supply their products into India through retailers. And a significant part of the trade will be done online. But if there is no mutual digital trade understanding in a framework-based agreement, I'm doubtful if this potential could be utilized. And New Zealand is the only country in the Asia Pacific, as far as I know, which has a data secure status under the EU's GDPR. It actually is, I think, a hesitation on the Indian side. India really would have benefited if they had been able to move into a digital trade clause. I don't know whether there were reservations about India's data localization clauses and everything, but this could be a limitation, because in that case, what happens is services trade remains limited.
Yes.
To probably just travel, at best education, that's enough. Secondly, the other point that you yourself raised, the investment clause. The investment clause is there in another FTA as well, which is India's FTA with the European Free Trade Agreement, EFTA countries. The problem with this clause is, and as it is a problem with all of India's FTAs, that India seems to be very eager to get investment commitments without providing investor protection. And I don't think the two go hand in hand, because why would foreign investors be willing to invest in India if they don't have investor protection? And that, I think, will remain a concern. I think there are countries which will be able to, quote unquote, extract that assurance from India, even without moving into the space of rules-based frameworks. The US can do it. US can arm twist into getting that concession. Other economies might be able to do it, but I'm not sure if, open economy middle powers like New Zealand and Australia will be able to do that. And to that extent, I am very doubtful about this investment commitment. So I'll just stop there, but I hope we will be able to reverse these thoughts as we go forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pali, for the question. Ivan has a question, but before I perhaps give the floor to Ivan for the question, because I have a similar thing with what Dr. Pali said on investment. Maybe I'll add on to that. It'll be easier maybe to respond it in one go, actually. So when I also heard about the investment thing, I was kind of thinking, particularly, like when you talk of market access in terms of trade, it is the government, the policy that the government takes in terms of, say, for example, providing tariff concessions, right, or some flexibilities. But when it comes to investment, it is the private sector that has to actually take the lead. So I was thinking, even if this clause in investment would not be there, if India would be a place where foreign investors would see an opportunity, they would naturally go over there in such a big market, right? But what has to be have in place are, again, the foreign investment friendly rules, regulations, one-stop kind of service, all those different things that the investors would be looking at. Now, in this case, I was kind of a bit puzzled that if you look at the trade part, I think India has got larger market access than New Zealand has got it, 100% duty free. And India itself, again, is saying that you have to commit a investment of $220 billion.
15 years, yeah.
15 years, right? So I was thinking if, say, for example, New Zealand had got 100% market access to India, and then India would put in this clause that, okay, I'll give you this market access, but then you commit $20 billion investment, that would maybe make some sense. But here it was both that India is asking for, and with the investment kind of thing, I mean, even with, I think Japan had committed what, like $500 billion investment to the US, right? Under the tariff kind of negotiation. But what has happened to that? We don't know, because the government itself cannot go on with investments. It is the private sector that has to do it, right?
Yes.
Now, if this is the clause on which all this is, that India is trying to hold on, and that it has got that a review of after 15 years and all that, yeah, I was also a little doubtful about how this will go forward, how this will be addressed. Maybe you can have a response on this, and then we can go for the next round of the question, if it's not related to this one. Eva? Okay.
Okay. No, thank you very much. And I think you've raised two very, very pertinent points, because obviously digital trade, as Amitendra has mentioned, is a very important part of New Zealand's, every other New Zealand FTAs, I think, that has been negotiated so far. If I am correct, I'm not too sure about the more recent ones. But clearly, given the fact that even, India wants to, review its trade relationship with ASEAN, where ASEAN has already had this DEFA agreement now, and New Zealand has a digital economy partnership agreement with some countries. It's clearly something which is, I think, very important here to drive this relationship forward, particularly in terms of trade and services, as you had mentioned. So definitely, we might expect, at the point of ratification, or maybe after ratification, when there is a review coming up, because clearly, when the new government takes over, which will be sometimes in November, even if this agreement comes into force, if it's not the current dispensation, I'm pretty sure they would want to have a review. And when they want a review, I'm sure they will have to think of both these issues that you've raised, which is on digital trade and also on investor protection. And the reason I'm saying this is because right now, I believe the first of all, given the pace at which this FTA was negotiated, as I said, within 9 months, I think the focus in terms of the negotiations, when it was initially driven from New Zealand, as I understand, was largely by the very big businesses in New Zealand who wanted to have the market access into India. So the initial focus has always been market access, and that too also because of the distance factor, because there is no direct flight yet. It is probably going to happen in 2028, as I understand from the latest news from the CEO, but I don't know whether that will happen. But at least till then, an average trip, even for small business in New Zealand to look at opportunities in India, is going to cost at least around $10,000+. So given that kind of money involved, I think it is really important for New Zealand businesses to really be very clear about what are the opportunities that exist for specific products in specific states. And that's why I was talking about the business literacy, because the traditional model for most New Zealand businesses have been actually either direct exports or through distributors. So given that model, also the investment, as you rightly pointed out, will be a challenge to achieve. And as I mentioned in the beginning itself, this is a new model for New Zealand, because they have never had investment driven trade, in their trade agreements. And of course, their outward FDI has generally never been mostly to developing countries. So What I feel is going to happen is with these smaller examples that I mentioned to you, like the New Zealand Bioeconomy Science Institute, and probably after the FTA is ratified, some center of excellence is coming up in horticulture or in, kiwi or, dairy partnerships and things like that. The success stories of those will largely drive, how New Zealand businesses will perceive this investment to go on in the longer term. Yes, investor protection will be a very important part of it. And again, I believe that both these might be coming up in, a near future review of this FTA. But for now, the real challenge, and which will be kind of covering both these aspects, is that if this investment has to be realized, it has to be done through New Zealand businesses, as you rightly mentioned. And most of the New Zealand businesses are SMEs. And SMEs, as I mentioned, because of the distance factor and because of their lack of business literacy about India in general and states more specifically, because there isn't much kind of awareness that they have around which states really are the growth states for their specific businesses. So I think therefore it will take the collective efforts here from both the Indian diaspora in New Zealand, and also with this facilitating mechanism that will be set up, and hopefully that will be effective enough for SMEs to actually think about, investing. And that being said, if I'm not wrong, there is an SME chapter in this FTA, and it actually will allow for, SME cooperation disc to be set up as well as part of this FTA. So until it's, of course, ratified, we don't know what shape that is going to take, and whether that will really benefit the SMEs. But clearly, if those New Zealand SMEs have to succeed over 15 years, I completely agree with you that investor protection as well as digital trade will have to come into picture in the near future reviews.
Sorry, Ivan, that I had to hold you.
Thank you so much for a very kind of detailed introduction to the New Zealand-India trade and the FTA. My original question was very much answered, actually, but let me ask you a broader question about trade. Some provisions of this FTA seem to create precedent, especially the dairy stuff. And a lot of media commentaries interpreting this FTA as a step toward potential Indian application to join the CPTPP. So to what an extent do you think that this is a step in this direction? And do you think that there is serious interest on the Indian side about this? Because there has been a lot of discussion about this for many years, but I'm not sure whether there is any substance to this discussion. And of course, other people, I'm sure, know also a lot on this topic, so can join the discussion. Thank you.
I'm sure Amitendu will probably be able to tell you more on India's interest in CPTPP. We know more about it. But clearly, I don't see this immediately as India's interest in joining into the CPTPP as such. But what this might eventually lead into, and this is just my hunch, but what this might eventually lead into is sort of a broader, maybe regional trade and economic partnership, which involves Australia and New Zealand sort of as a region rather than as a bilateral. So, because Australia is already negotiating the SECA, which is upgrading its, current trade agreement. And that, by the way, might actually come up, including digital trade and investor protection both, because that is going to be focused on services and investment. So if that happens, then definitely New Zealand will ask for these provisions if it does happen for the Australia SECA. But what I believe is that is something which could happen, because essentially, when you look at Australia, New Zealand region vis-a-vis India, it's quite interesting that, from New Zealand perspective, you have more of the agribusiness and productivity, which is of interest for India. And from Australia's side, it is more of the strategic minerals and mining. So ultimate, and given the shared interest of both all the countries in terms of maritime security, this is where it might converge into. Now from there, whether it will drive India's interests to ultimately think about CPTPP, I really don't know. But again, if it is at all interested in getting into CPTPP, then again, it will have to think about a lot more of including those deeper provisions, because clearly a lot of the CPTPP provisions go much more deeper than the current India's bilateral FTAs. Yeah.
Any other questions from the floor? Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Sen. That was a very wonderful presentation. Because I don't know a lot about New Zealand, India, but there were some things that I just wanted to ask whether there has been a discussion between India and New Zealand. I can't help but notice that despite of having a very vast maritime corporation and strategic cooperation between the two countries, and given that New Zealand also joined the Global Biofuels Alliance. But regardless of that, there hasn't been any conversations on maritime decarbonization between the two countries, whereas India has been actually able to establish that with Singapore, their green shipping and maritime decarbonization corridor. So I was just wondering if there has been any conversations about this. The second area that I thought was also sort of missing in their partnership was any conversations around semiconductors. Even though I know New Zealand has a very niche sector of chip design, but and it has recently also acquired a lot of funding for data centers, but there hasn't been any sort of representation of these in their partnership, or that I am aware of. So I was just wondering if these sectors also are a missing link or a gap that have been realized. And my second question was about the kind of public discourse about these the momentum, as you mentioned, between the two countries, whether it has been received very well in the civil society or like, I don't know, research institutes within New Zealand. How has like public received these developments over the years? Thank you.
Okay. Great questions. And I'll probably start with the third one because, the public perceptions really have been, quite what I would say. In some cases, I found them to be a bit surprising. But I'll just give you a little bit of the background because in New Zealand, what happens is the mainstream media, which is essentially the papers where most of the news comes through, they historically haven't really paid much attention to developments on India, particularly on the Indian economy. Like I'll give you an example. When India was successful in landing Chandrayaan on the moon, even that news wasn't really covered very significantly enough in the media. So what has happened over the years is while governments, or at least the recent government, has taken upon it to drive this relationship, it has maybe recognized the potential of the diaspora, the potential of the Indian economy to get this FTA through. But prior to that, and also even during this government's tenure, the media hasn't really picked up in a very favorable way. One, because they have traditionally always viewed India as, in that low income developing country kind of space. And, they haven't, I mean, I found it very surprising that when a lot of the actual achievements in infrastructure were happening in India, I found very rare mention of it in the mainstream media. However, there's a lot of Indian ethnic media in New Zealand where there's a lot of news published on New Zealand economy, on what's the Indian economy, and what's been happening and so on. But to me, these two kind of are not in sync at the moment. And I think that is one of the key reasons why what happens is, particularly with the FTA, when because of the issues around the investor clause and also around the labor mobility, we had this comments coming from, some of the political parties saying that, well, this is opening the doors to immigration, and therefore, this is not going to be beneficial. Similarly, for investment, clearly there's been a lot of skepticism around there. And because there has been, I'll have to admit this, that in general, unlike Australia, which had a very clear strategy in terms of what it wanted to do in India, and there was a very clear strategy paper to 2035 that was there on the basis of which the negotiations were done, at least for the first agreement. There was no clear cut strategy paper that was publicly available. So, as a result, a lot of New Zealanders believed that the reason why this particular government wanted to get this FTA done was mainly for political purposes, given that they had the support of the large Indian diaspora. And because of this view, and of course, with what has been happening with some of the backlash against Indians in general in the Western countries, what has happened now is that everything about India, about FTA in the New Zealand mainstream media, a lot of people in general, without even reading some of the stories, are actually commenting on it very negatively, because they have this perception that the government has done something which basically we were not made aware of, and we believe that there could be serious concerns here. So that is why I think it is really important to have a proper outreach on this FTA, and to make it very clear that, one, this FTA doesn't have anything to do with promoting immigration from India, because it is clearly about temporary mobility, 3 years, non-renewable. I think the government has sent that message to these parties. It's not that it hasn't. But what happens is, FTA documents are very big. No one bothers to read through all these detailed clauses and lines. But when you read through them, it becomes very clear that's not the intention. So there is no intention, first of all, for immigration. And secondly, the investor clause also has been in the media sort of, projected as something because of which, New Zealand will ultimately, be penalized. Now, I agree that, if there isn't enough investor protection, or these things do not work, like in the case of the investment facilitation mechanism that we're talking about, it could be possible that the investment amounts may not be realized. And by the way, even in this agreement, there's a very interesting sort of footnote that I had noted, that while this goal has been set to have this 20 billion over 15 years, India has also mentioned that we recognize that because of geopolitical issues or any other uncertainty, there could be reasons to, review this, aspiration. So we never know, given the whole uncertainty in the economic environment globally, and also how things are going to work out in the next couple of years. In the next review, that number might even be scaled down. We do not know exactly what is going to happen. So to really drive home the point, yes, unfortunately, this FTA hasn't generally being received very positively across mainstream New Zealand. But New Zealand businesses, particularly the ones which already have been in India or have had the experience of dealing with India, have been very forthcoming. And New Zealand businesses actually helped a lot to get the Labour Party actually on board for getting that broad-based support. So definitely, from the business perspective, at least, I'm not talking about the civil society, from the business perspective, I think they see a lot of potential here. But the real question, of course, is that whether these challenges can be overcome, and whether ultimately we are able to utilize it. Regarding your other two questions around maritime carbonization, I don't think there's been any discussion around maritime carbonization as far as I remember. And there is no separate sort of climate change sort of provisions also kind of included at the moment in this FTA, which is also quite surprising, I would believe, because given that climate change is again a very, shared sort of issue, which is going to affect countries in the Indo-Pacific. So, and your third point, sorry, I think I might have forgotten about that. Yeah, semiconductor. So semiconductor, excuse me. Semiconductors is something which I think is in New Zealand, there might be very few companies which might have been involved in this. So in general, from what I have seen, at least discussed in the FTA, the focus for now has been largely mostly on agricultural products. Manufacturing products, including probably some semiconductors, will be getting a tariff concession, but there won't be immediate tariff elimination. Tariff elimination will be mainly on all agri products. So maybe in a couple of years, if New Zealand is also further developing its capabilities in that area, we might see more further tariff reductions coming up. But at the moment, I don't see semiconductors as a very priority sector, at least from the Indian perspective in the New Zealand and FTA. Yeah.
Make a comment on something. I mean, don't take me very seriously. There's a FTA that India has signed in recent years. I'm not going to name that FTA, which was described in the partner country. Described in the partner country legislature as a bag of soggy papadums. I'm hoping this FTA down the line doesn't get described as, stingy kheer or something like that, given the overwhelming presence of dairy in the whole scheme of things. So, I mean, just joking on that.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Palit, for that. I think we have crossed our allocated time, but we had started 5 minutes late. Maybe just a quick question to ask you. That's very minor one actually. Like this FTA got through in 9 months' time, as you said. How much of this actually did build on what had been agreed earlier? Because if it was only the dairy that was sticking earlier, and once that was taken off, and then perhaps there wasn't much need to do on the new FTA, so that it could have been done in 9 months. Can this be taken as an example that fresh FTA can be concluded in 9 months' time, or is it because something had already happened at the time?
I don't know. I mean, to me, it's also quite surprising because, as I said, when initially Prime Minister Lakson, when he took over as Prime Minister 3 years back, he said, my strategic priority is to get this FTA within the first year of my term. Everyone doubted. No, not it would be possible. I think the reason why it happened in a record time is not just because, of the fact that, there was maybe a, prior template obviously must have been there. And clearly, the dairy was one of the key issues, which they did, work out, particularly through the ingredient aspect. And of course, the temporary mobility, I think, was one of the key, things included in there. There are two things I think which might have helped. One was, of course, India was in parallel negotiating other FTAs like with European Free Trade Agreement and others. So there was already a very clear template of those new age FTAs in terms of, investment and labor provisions and so on. So India clearly kind of knew what to put on the table. From New Zealand's perspective, I think the reason why it got concluded in 9 months, and to me, one of the prime reasons is that increasing trade diversion that was happening, in favor of Australia. And clearly, there was a lot of pressure from the wine and alcoholic industries because New Zealand wine was losing market at a very rapid pace because Australia had got a significant amount of tariff access for the last 3 years because of the trade agreement. So New Zealand Wine Association, and I believe also Zespri, which is basically the kiwi fruit business in New Zealand, the big ones, as well as some other big New Zealand businesses. I think they really wanted to make sure that this happens and New Zealand doesn't suffer that trade diversion, and they're able to get that level playing field as soon as possible. So there was clearly a sense of urgency around this that drove it. Plus, of course, the fact that the geopolitical environment was such that both countries wanted to look for alternative countries for greater market access. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Sen. I think with that, we will conclude today's seminar. Thank you, everyone, for joining. And thank you, Dr. Sen, once again.
My pleasure. Thank you.